All right. Welcome. My name is Steve Hambric, and I'm here to give you a report on an I-INCE sponsored symposium held earlier this year on flow-induced noise and vibration issues and aspects, called FLINOVIA for short. And this is, in fact, the second FLINOVIA. The first one was held in Rome in 2013, but I'll be talking about this one, and it was organized by myself and Amanda Hanford and held at the Penn State Center for Acoustics and Vibration earlier this year in April. There are several I-INCE-sponsored symposia over the years, and here are a few of them. That's not all of them. If you go to the I-INCE website, you can find the full list, along with the instructions for giving them, and a call for proposals. So if anybody's interested in doing one of these things in the future, you're more than welcome to submit a proposal. And it wasn't just Amanda and I that organized this. So we had several co-organizers, including those that were those responsible for the first one in Rome, our colleagues in Italy, Sergio De Rosa and Francesco Franco from the University of Naples, and Elena Chiappi from I-INCE. And they, along with Jean-Louis Guyader from INSA de Lyon and Randolph Lung from Hong Kong Poly, helped us organize this year's FLINOVIA. Now, I-INCE sponsored it, but we also had sponsorship from Penn State, the Center for Acoustics and Vibration, which I helped chair, and also our Institute for Cyber Science. I-INCE symposia aren't that big. They're typically 50 to 100 attendees, and we had a little over 100 this year. And I'm pleased to announce that it wasn't just academia. We had people from industry and government. We had at least a quarter from outside the USA, so it was an international symposium. And it wasn't just Penn State either. We had universities from all over the country. Here's a picture of most of us. It was held in spring, so we see some nice blooming trees there at Penn State. And if you guys have great eyes, you can catch our I-INCE Secretary General, Paul Donovan, right here, who also attended the symposium and gave a talk. We had, again, a lot of contributors, half from outside of the US. So this is a flag test. See if you can identify all the flags here. But they were, again, half from the US, half outside, and from within the United States, we had contributions from several of the universities and some companies, mostly on the West Coast. So a nice diverse community contributing to the work. This is a word cloud. We were trying to figure out how to organize all of the papers, and so I took all the abstracts and plugged them into an online program that you tell it how many words you want, what the frequencies you want, and it gives you this cute little word cloud. And so you can see some of the key words that show up in the presentations that were given at the symposium. And you'll hear me use these quite a bit as I go through the presentation coming up. The word cloud helped us organize the papers into pretty cohesive groups. And what we saw is we had a group of papers predominantly focused on flow, and we held those on the first day of the conference, and we further subdivided those into a group of papers on forcing functions, how the flow forcing functions generated sound, and then two groups of works on experiments and numerical methods. And a little bit less than half the papers focused primarily on the vibroacoustic response of components and systems to those forcing functions. And we broke those up into numerical methods and experiments. And then we had a few papers that were so innovative we weren't quite sure how to qualify them, and so we gave them their own group called Innovative Applications. And what I'm going to do in this talk is go through an overview of the field of flow-induced noise and vibration. Certainly not exhaustive, but hopefully a good overview, drawing from the materials that were presented at the symposiums. I've picked some of my favorite slides and put them together in a hopefully cohesive order to explain the field. And I thought I'd start with what a typical wall pressure forcing function might look like. This is a CFD simulation, and I'll talk about these sorts of things in more detail shortly. And it's a simulation of the flow, the jet flow, discharging from a nozzle, which is up here on the left, and propagating over a plate downstream. So the blue arrow indicates the flow direction. And what you can see is this does not look like a clean, purely propagating acoustic wavefront if I were to just aim a speaker at the plate at a certain angle, for example. Instead, what I have is a series of partially correlated, almost independent sources, and that's due to the turbulence in the jet flow that's coming out of the nozzle. So these forcing fields are partially correlated over space, and they're convecting at a certain velocity. And those two aspects are what make these flow-induced forcing functions so interesting, and particularly make it very complicated to determine how well a structure underneath those forces is going to respond. So in a moment, I'll go through how these sorts of forcing functions are measured and how they're simulated. And I'll focus on both the autocorrelations and autospectra, that would be, say, a point pressure measurement, and the streamwise and cross-flow correlations and convection velocities. But first, let's look at a little flow chart of some of the topics that we talked about. And it all starts with turbulent flow. So as I go through these slides, I'm going to have these images, and I'm going to give credit to the author of each one. So at the very beginning of the brief, you saw that we had a website, FLINOVIA.org, and on that website you can find zip files of all the presentations and 2-page extended abstracts. And so if you want more information, just go grab them and you can read up on it. But Pézera from Laume in France put together this little diagram, and what it has is a red line indicating a vibrating structure, and then it has kind of a bunch of squiggles in green that indicate the turbulent eddies within the flow, whatever that is, a boundary layer or perhaps a jet. And in this case, he's calling it a turbulent boundary layer. And this set of squiggles does two things. Number one, the turbulence radiates sound directly. And number two, that turbulence excites the underlying structure. Once that structure is excited, it starts vibrating, and if there's a neighboring acoustic medium, which there always is, that structure then radiates sound. So we'll talk about each one of those elements. Now, what I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, in fact, not at all, is another very important topic, and in fact, a topic that inspired a lot of this work early on in the 1960s and 70s, and that is what happens to the structure when it is excited over a long period of time. And what happens is you get a lot of alternating stresses in the material, and over a long period of time, that material might fatigue, fail, and damage. The early aircraft people were quite concerned about this when looking at high-speed aircraft in the 60s and 70s. How long a fatigue life would the fuselage have? So this is another diagram from Pézera. And what I want to do here is, number one, introduce some applications. These are the pictures up on the top. And number two, talk about a way of viewing the different kinds of wave numbers that we have in the forcing functions, the structural response, and the acoustic radiation. So let's start with the pictures, and let's start over here on the left. So we have a couple of pictures of marine applications. Here's a submarine, and here's a ship, a catamaran. And because of the nature of the drag in heavy fluid like water, these vehicles don't move very fast. And so what that means is that the flow is traveling quite slowly over the surface. If I take those vehicles and take them out of the water and put wheels on them, like for a car or in a train, we can speed them up. The drag in the air is much less than that of water. And then if I take these vehicles, take the tires off and put wings on them, then I've got aircraft, like airplanes and launch vehicles. And the speed is much, much higher then. So a favorite way of comparing the flow wave numbers, the structural response wave numbers, and the acoustic radiation wave numbers is to put them on these wave number frequency diagrams. So each one of these is an individual wave number frequency plot for convective waves, that's associated with the flow speed of the turbulence over the structure. The acoustic waves, and that depends on the sound speed. And then the flexural waves in the structure themselves. And the wave number, just as a reminder, is simply frequency divided by one of these three sound speeds. So if I start over here on the left and look at the underwater subsonic flow, the way you read these things is that if you have a very low flow speed, you wind up with a very strong slope on the convective wave number. It's, remember, omega over u. So that's a slow speed wave number, and that indicates a lot of waves over a small distance. Since the flow is subsonic, the acoustic wave speed is a lot faster, so I've got a much smaller slope on that. And this green curve indicates the flexural waves, and this is not a straight slope. This is in fact curved, and that's because flexural waves are dispersive. They're slow at low frequencies, and they're fast at high frequencies. Now, where these curves intersect is where all the fun happens. So at very low frequencies in this example, The flexural waves intersect with the convective waves, and the convective excitation will excite the structure very efficiently. We'll have a lot of vibration. But not so much radiation. I have to go up to very high frequencies before the structural and the acoustic waves intersect, and I get strong radiation. Now, if I go into light fluid, number one, my acoustic wave speed comes down, and therefore the acoustic wave number goes up, more waves over that distance. My coincidence frequency comes down. It's not really shown in this plot, but the convective wave number is going to come down as well because the speed usually speeds up. And then at very high speeds, you can see that the convective wave number gets quite small because we're, in fact, in this example, going supersonic, so that it is above the acoustic wave number. And we get very different coupling between the structures and the excitation depending on these wave number differences. And that's led to quite different approaches to these problems in the different communities. So let's go back to the forcing functions and look at both measurements and simulations. And I'll start with some measurements. And I'll start with high speed. These are from DLR. And what DLR did is look at the turbulent boundary layer induced wall pressures. Here's a little picture of a boundary layer, probably much bigger than it really is. And they mounted wall pressure sensors from a company called Coolite, very commonly used in the aerospace community, up at the front, in the middle, and downstream. And they've color-coded these little images helpfully to compare to the wall pressure autospectra that they've measured. And this is a very typical autospectrum. What we have is a low-frequency plateau, a knee, and then at high frequencies, a dramatic reduction in wall pressures. And this is on a log scale, so this is quite a reduction up here at high frequencies. We can also see that the low-frequency pressures tend to grow as the boundary layer gets bigger and propagates downstream. As it gets bigger, the eddies that are turbulent get bigger and contribute more to the low frequencies. This is quite typical of a progressing boundary layer flow. Also from Germany, but from the Bundeswehr, are Absfagen and his colleagues, and they measured undersea vehicle wall pressures. And so this is a towed body with some stabilizing fins. And this is an acoustic window underneath of which they have a hydrophone array, so a different way of measuring pressures. And they dragged it behind a boat. If you have good eyes, you can see the little fins here underwater. And they dragged the boat through the water at varying speeds, so they could measure the wall pressure spectra at low speeds and at high speeds. And one of the things we can see in this plot is that when you increase the flow speed, the wall pressure fluctuations also increase dramatically. And in fact, the scale is the dynamic head, and so this is a spectrum. It's the dynamic head squared. But you can also see that as you increase the speed, the knee in the curve is shifting over to higher and higher frequencies. And that's because the scales are changing. So in fact, if you were to plot this on a non-dimensional frequency, which we have not done here, take frequency and divide it by the flow speed, the knees would align at the same screw hall number. That's what we call the non-dimensional frequency. And if I further scale the amplitudes, I can get these curves to collapse onto a fairly universal curve. The other thing to notice is that these amplitudes are high at much lower frequencies in water, again, because the flow speed is so much smaller. The knees in the curve are at lower frequencies than they are here for the in-air high-speed application. Now, that's boundary layer flow over long surfaces, like on a vehicle body. But there's another area of interest, which is very important, and that's turbo machines. So we have airfoils over which boundary layers form and grow and generate forcing functions. And for airfoils, we usually care most about what's happening at the trailing edge. So this is just the back half of an airfoil. I've cut off the front part here. And these are measurements made by Scott Morris at Notre Dame. And this was done using a combination of pressure sensors in the wall. And the colors you're seeing are from an optical measurement technique. And in this case, he's plotting something either vorticity or related to vorticity, where you've got positive and negative vorticity on the top and the bottom. But the point that he makes with this example is how much the wall pressures change as the flow propagates downstream. So at this blue location, we have a wall pressure spectrum that looks a bit like we saw previously. We have a plateau, and he hasn't gone high enough in frequency for us to see the knee and the curve too clearly here. But this is the suction side of the airfoil. What's happening here as the flow propagates downstream is it's encountering bigger and bigger areas, and this induces something called an adverse pressure gradient. The flow slows down. And when the flow slows down, the eddies get bigger, and the energy all shifts to different frequency ranges. So we have here is a slightly increased amplitude here. That's because of the pressure gradient, and even more of an increased amplitude here, but a shift downward in frequency as the flow speed decreases. So the flow over these edges can be quite different, propagating from front to back. That's just one part of the problem. That gives us the amplitudes, but we also need to know how correlated the flow is. And we get that from measuring things like cross correlations in time or coherences in frequency. And I've got two examples of that here. Continuing with the work by Morris at Notre Dame, he's got an array of pressure transducers, streamwise and cross-stream. I believe this plot is of the cross-stream measurements. And what you're seeing here is the coherence as a function of separation distance. So as the pressure sensors are separated by wider and wider amounts, the correlation gets smaller and smaller. Not labeled on here, but also included on here, are sets of data for different flow speeds. And as the flow speed increases, the correlation also increases. So you can integrate this and come up with something called an integral length scale, essentially the rough size of the net pressure forcing function on the surface. Over on the right is more data from the towed underwater vehicle from Abshagen. And this is looking at the frequency dependence of the coherence. And this shows what I was trying to explain here, that as the flow increases in speed, the coherence increases as well, not only over space, but in this case, over frequency. So that's another part of the forcing function that we need to solve for either radiated noise or structural response. Now, it's actually, I think, in some cases easier to measure forcing functions than it is to predict them. And predictions have been around for a long time, back in the 1960s, again, mostly motivated by aerospace industry concerns. A lot of measurements were made, and empirical forcing functions were postulated assuming certain functional forms, like exponential decays over space and oscillations in the convection direction, where you could take these empirical models and plug in things like boundary layer thickness, flow speed, some other parameters, and generate an approximate forcing function and correlations as well. More recently, we've decided that's not good enough, and two other approaches have emerged. One is these empirical models have been augmented, more variables added. And when I say augmented, I mean augmented by other computations, such as computational fluid dynamics, Reynolds average Navier-Stokes models. And I've got an example of that down here from Croker from University of New South Wales in Australia, where he's got an airfoil and a flow profile from a RANS solution. Now, what RANS gives you is a couple of things. It'll give you a mean flow distribution. That means you can get all of the flow gradients and the Reynolds stresses. But it also gives you a piece of the unsteadiness, and that piece is going to be the RMS intensity, how strong the turbulence is, and it gives you a length scale, which you can then use to estimate the integral length scale. And those two components, plugged into some of these expanded empirical models, will do a pretty nice job of generating a forcing function for you. But more recently, as computing power has dramatically increased, we've seen more people go towards something called large eddy simulation, where they're not just solving for the mean flow, they're actually doing a time-accurate solution of the turbulence in the flow along with the mean flow. So here is a snapshot of a time history LES calculation from Croker. And once again, this is something related to vorticity, because you can see the different colors, the blue on the top and the red on the bottom, indicating different senses of the vorticity of the turbulence. And this is just like a measurement. It's a virtual measurement of all of the velocities, but more importantly, all of the surface pressures. So you can take those pressures and compute autospectra. You can take separations of pressures and compute cross correlations and convection velocities, and take those and either compute radiated sound or excite a structure and compute the structural response. Now, that's a 2D example. Computers have gotten so powerful that people have gotten even more ambitious and are solving incredibly complicated problems now. Here's another example from Croker on the left, where he has a strut mounted into a wall. And we're looking at three different kinds of turbulence here. We have the boundary layer that's forming over the surface, and as it propagates downstream, it gets stronger and stronger in intensity. So you can see the turbulence here. That'll excite the trailing edge, also radiate sound. Up at the tip, we have tip vortices forming along the edges. This is the kind of thing you might see in aircraft wings without winglets. And at the bottom, we have a boundary layer coming in and generating junction vortices along the root. And at the top and the bottom, these different forcing phenomena mix with each other to make things even more complicated and difficult. But if you have a time-accurate solution, in theory, you can compute all of the forcing functions together and the resulting noise and structural excitation. Now, this is self-generated turbulence. On the right is an example from Wang and his students at Notre Dame, looking at turbulence ingestion. That's another very important topic in flow noise. And what this is if the turbulence coming into, or the flow coming into the structure is turbulent, then as the blades rotate past the turbulence, more unsteady forces and noise is generated. And as you can see, the data from these calculations becomes extremely complicated. It's very hard to post-process. In some cases, the post-processing is just as difficult as the actual simulation itself. But the attraction is that everything is there, in theory, but with a limitation. And I'll show you that limitation shortly. So let's look at how accurate these different forcing function methods are, starting with some of the empirical and CFD augmented empirical approaches. This is from DLR again, and what they're doing is they're taking their measurements, that's the non-smooth looking curves at different locations, and they're comparing empirical models, those are the ones that don't agree as well, with more informed or CFD augmented models, and those are the ones that agree much better. And this is again where they're taking CFD RAND solutions, computing boundary layer parameters, flow velocities, other quantities, and plugging them into their empirical models to get better agreement with measurements. Now, this isn't exactly LES, but here's a full numerical attempt at computing the wall pressure forcing functions at one location. And here we can see the good and the bad of LES. And again, I'm not sure this is exactly LES, but I'm going to use this as an LES example. And that is this: at low frequencies, the large eddies are modeled, and large eddies are what cause the low frequency noise. But all of those models have a cutoff. They're only good up to a certain frequency at which the eddies become too small to model, and they're no longer modeled. And what happens then is, of course, you're not capturing all of the energy. Now, this can be improved, but what that means is smaller and smaller grids, bigger and bigger models, longer computing times, bigger file storage, and all of that. So there are limitations to these LES models. So we've got some idea of what the forcing functions look like, either through measurements or simulations. How about looking at the kind of sound they radiate? Here's an example of some measurements made by Davenport and his team at Virginia Tech, where they've taken a spinning rotor and put it in a wind tunnel. And they've aimed two types of turbulence at it. Up at the top, we have sort of a jet flow impinging upon the top part of the rotor. So as the blades spin by that jet, they're, number one, excited by the non-uniform flow. That'll generate some vane passing tones. But also the turbulence will cause randomness and widen the noise about those tones. On the bottom, they've got a wall boundary layer where the blades are spinning past the boundary layer. And the same sort of thing happens, but the turbulent boundary layer sources are different. And there's two clever contour plots of radiated sound measured at these pressure locations by these microphones. On the x-axis is frequency. On the y is something called the advance coefficient. That's the flow speed, axial flow speed, divided by the rotation speed of the rotor and the diameter of the rotor. So in this case, as J increases, RPM is going down, and the vane passing frequencies are going down. These dashed lines indicate the vane passing frequencies. And as you see red, that indicates a lot of noise. Blue indicates very little. And if we just had no turbulence in the flow, but just sort of a mean flow difference around the circumference here as the rotor spins past it, you would see just constant, nearly constant red lines along these vane passing frequencies. But since we have random turbulence, what it does is alternately slow the flow down or speed it up, and that generates a random, almost Gaussian function about these blade passing frequencies. Now, in the bottom case, the turbulence is not as strong as the jet, so we don't see quite as much of a variation around the passing tones. How do we model this sound? There's different ways of doing it. The most rigorous way is to simply include the acoustic wave equation along with your Reynolds average, or excuse me, along with the Navier-Stokes equation. That's difficult. Instead, what is probably most common is something called a hybrid method, where CFD is used, large eddy simulation again, or something similar, and the aero and hydrodynamic pressures are captured along with the velocities. But then a post-processing step is used where those CFD solutions are plugged into an acoustic analogy approach, something like those developed by Lighthill, Curl, or Fox William Hawkins many, many years ago. That works quite well for free field radiation, but if you've got an obstruction between the source and your receiver, such as a duct around a jet engine, it's more appropriate to use a numerical method like a boundary element or finite element analysis. Here's an example from DLR. This is looking at a centrifugal turbo machine, a compressor. And in this example, the CFD was used to solve for the flow in the passage here and in the discharge region. And then that flow solution was taken and then post-processed with an acoustic model of the discharge region and the discharge ducting. So all of the pressure contours you're seeing here are acoustic, positive and negative. So you can see the wavelengths in the duct direction, as well as wavelengths across the duct at this slice that they've computed. So that's forcing functions, direct radiated sound. Let's talk about the fun part, and that's structural response calculations. These are even more difficult. Once you have the forcing function, you can do a couple of different things. Now, if you're lucky, and the structural motion is small and does not influence the flow field itself, you can use something called a blocked approach. That means the forcing functions from your flow solution can simply be applied to a structural model, and you don't have to worry about the interaction between the two. If you're not so lucky and the structural motion is large and affects the flow solution, then you have a strongly coupled fluid structure interaction problem. And that means both solutions have to be coupled together, and this gets even more computationally intensive. And I'll show you examples of that shortly. So this is not from the FLINOVIA, but from a paper I did at the Novum conference in 2005. And this is showing an example of a flow field around a propeller, a pressure distribution that varies over space and time. Here's a little notional example of what that pressure distribution might look like in the flow direction and the cross flow direction. And I'm not going to go through the equations here, but I will talk about the bottom one. This is the classic frequency domain blocked forcing function structural response calculation approach, where we have a triple matrix multiply. The GPP here is the cross-spectral density matrix of the pressure distribution. This includes the amplitudes, it includes the cross correlations or coherences, and the convection if it exists. And the H's are simple structural acoustic response functions, and these are easily generated from analytical solutions, finite element models, even measurements. Now, what happens a lot, particularly for low flow speeds, is that these structural modes that generate our H functions back here tend to be much lower in wave number than the forcing functions. This is an example from the paper by Lysak, which shows what the forcing function distribution looks like at about some reference point at low frequencies, medium frequencies, and high frequencies. At low frequencies, we get a bigger correlation. High frequencies, a much smaller one. But just compare these positive and negative pressure functions and the correlations with the mode shape. This is just a big filter. All this convective stuff that you're seeing in the contour is not going to excite that structure. But underneath that distribution are low wave number components, which will. And that's what makes this coupling problem so complicated, is that the structure is responding to very, very small effective pressure distributions. Now, the frequency domain approach works fine if you have stationary and ergodic forcing functions. If you don't, if your forcing functions are more complicated than that and have strange variations over time, then you have to go to a time domain approach. This is the nozzle example I showed earlier, except now looking at the nozzle. This is some work that we did for Pratt & Whitney. So we have a converging nozzle, and the flow discharges here and then suddenly diffuses. And in this example, we're adding another complication. This is supersonic discharge flow. And the little light lines you're seeing in this surface contour are shock cells. The turbulence propagates past the shock cells and shakes this entire field around, causing an extremely complicated forcing function that really doesn't look a whole lot like the models that you would get for a turbulent boundary layer. And in the bottom is an example of the structural response, The nozzle is on the left, and then the end of the plate is over here on the right. We've got free ends on the left and the right, and then clamped ends along the edges. And if you've got a really good memory, or if you're watching this online, you can go back to the forcing function animation and notice that the pressures in the forcing function were much higher wave number, more waves over that distance than the structural response function is showing you here. And this is illustrative of the structural filtering. We're getting low wave number structural response to a forcing function field that's dominated by high wave number excitation. So that's an example of how to compute a structural response. Now, the big question that all my sponsors ask me is, how accurate are all these approaches? There's a lot of different pieces going into this calculation. And the answer is, okay. Here is an example of probably the best agreeing response we could find. And all investigators do this. When they put together their papers, they find the example where the forcing or the simulations agree best with the experiments. And we're no exception. And at first glance, if you look at these comparisons, you think, boy, that's very nice agreement. We have non-dimensional frequency here. This is Struve-Hall number. And a non-dimensional displacement here. But if you look closely, you can see problems. Here's a mode that's not captured well at all. Here's some more. There are uncertainties and biases in everything we do. No forcing function is perfect, no structural model is perfect, and that leads to these differences. In this example, the edge boundary conditions, the measurement, they were bolted into a wall. And you might think that's an easy thing to model, but it's not. There's big differences in structural damping, differences in where the modes occur. The forcing functions are certainly not properly 100% captured by LES. There's always differences. And more on that in a moment. But first, one more method of computing the response of a structure to a turbulent flow. And this is a similitude scaling-based approach being looked at by several people at Sherbrooke in Canada and Naples in Italy, along with INCE in Italy. And the supposition is this: if you can take a structure and put it in a appropriate flow-induced forcing function field and measure its response, and if you've got another structure that is perhaps bigger, smaller, different thickness, different material properties, the flow field is perhaps faster, slower. If they're similar, you can perhaps use scaling laws to simulate the response of this other structure in this other flow field. And that's what they're illustrating here. They've taken different plates and different flow conditions and shown that you can, in some cases, collapse those responses. So that's a very clever way of simulating the response of something else. Perhaps a sponsor asks you to change the design of something. It's got the same shape, but a different material. You can use these scaling laws to quickly estimate the response. All right, let's get back to accuracy. This is a couple of great slides by Paul Bremner. And he looked at some old data measured on a launch vehicle by Alan Pearsall, one of the founding fathers of random analysis response. And this is looking at the variation of vibration on a launch vehicle at several locations. So he has a mean. And over on the right, Paul has computed a relative variance, okay? And that's this dashed line here. So that's the variance of the response. And what he's doing here is he's trying to tell you what components contribute most to the variance, essentially to the uncertainty. And he's got a bunch of pieces here. The first is just the frequency bandwidth. That's well known. Let's not focus on that so much. But the others are uncertainty in the forcing function, uncertainty in the mean structural response, and uncertainty in the damping. And he's got a frequency-dependent set of individual uncertainties here. And what we can see is at low frequencies, all of these are fairly important. But at high frequencies, it's pretty much uncertainties in the forcing function and uncertainties in the structural damping that are most important to pursue. So this is kind of a pointer to the research that needs to be done in the future to improve our accuracy at higher frequencies. So I've gone through the overall procedure for measuring or simulating flow-induced vibration and sound. If we have a high vibration level or sound level, what can we do about it? We had a couple of papers at FLINOVIA that talked about that. The first is looking at how to reduce jet noise. This is by Morris and McLaughlin at Penn State. And what we have is a supersonic jet discharging a nozzle. There's a lot of that work done at Penn State. And what we're showing here are different pressure measurements as a function of frequency, non-dimensional frequency. and the angle off of the jet flow direction. And what they're doing here is they're injecting a small amount of flow right upstream of the discharge. And when you do that, you break up the strength of the turbulence, break up the coherence of the turbulence, and at certain flow angles can reduce the broadband sound. And this is ongoing work as they try to improve this to other angles as well. Our friends at CIRA in Italy, the Aerospace Center in Italy, have been looking at flapped wings and the sound that comes during landing. So we've got flow over a wing and a pretty ugly flow downstream around the flap during the landing process, and that generates a lot of sound at the surface. And this is a numerical simulation of an attempt to put in a perforated liner to try to reduce the sound that reflects off of that surface and propagates down to the ground. This is the angular distribution of the sound reductions that they predicted with their models, and they have ongoing measurements to try to see if they can capture the same reductions. Here is an example of an extremely complicated fluid structure interaction problem, and this is modeling the sound that I am making right now. We are combining the structural vibration of my larynx with the acoustics inside the duct or cavity inside my larynx as well, and the flow that I am generating as I speak. This is some work done by Oriol Gouache from Spain and by Mike Crane at Penn State. And here's a couple of snapshots of some of Oriol's work, and these are extremely time intensive. We can only generate a few milliseconds of this, but this is a human mouth. So here's the top of the mouth, here's the bottom of the mouth, here's the larynx. And what he's trying to simulate is the noise that you make when you do a sibilant S. So here's his flow simulation, solved with a CFD solution, time accurate. And he plugs that into a light hill acoustic analogy to generate the sound field. And I'm summing up in a very simple slide what it took him months to calculate. So if you want more information, please go to the FLINOVIA site and download it. So I think the FLINOVIA Symposium was a great success, and it really highlighted almost the full breadth of flow-induced vibration and sound work that's going on. And I know it's not everything, but I think it was a pretty good representation. There have, of course, been significant advances of everything I've been showing you. But there's still a lot of uncertainty and error, and I still point to the flow-induced forcing functions, along with structural damping, as probably the two biggest ones that we need advances in the future. Sadly, I was not able to include examples from everyone's papers, so here are the others that were equally as good, but just didn't quite fit into the overview I was doing. So once again, FLINOVIA.org will give you access to all of it. And there's more detail coming in a book to be published by Springer. So the intent of the FLINOVIA workshops is to first present and then document. So the first book from the Rome proceedings is available now. It had 15 papers. I'm pleased to report that the second one was twice as big. So we'll have a maximum of 30 papers coming out in 2018. And I'm pleased to announce that our colleagues in France have agreed to host FLINOVIA III in Lyon in fall 2019. We are hoping to continue with the flow-induced noise and vibration track at this internoise and future internoises. So we've already had a few sessions here. There are more ongoing and coming up, so I encourage you to attend. And I also encourage this year's authors and hopefully other authors to participate in Chicago in 2018. So thanks for your attention. I've got time for maybe one or two questions. Yes, please.
Thanks for the presentation. I have a question with the flow structure, and actually is a one-way. I mean, in your simulation, you calculated the flow-induced force and then calculated the structure to response. But if the structure is vibrates, maybe the flow field is changed. Yeah.
Right, so the question is regarding when do you know whether you have to do a fluid structure interaction analysis? You have to look at the waves that are generated by the structure and also the amplitudes of the structural vibration and compare those amplitudes to the flow amplitudes of the turbulence itself. If they're similar, then you might have to go and do a coupled calculation. If they're not, then everything is okay. And regrettably, I'll have to stop now to give time to our next speakers. So thank you again, and I'm happy to take questions after the session is over. Thanks.